In the span of just one decade, three of Europe's most powerful royal families quietly changed their names. The Saxe-Coburg and Gothas became the Windsors, the Battenbergs became the Mountbattens, and the Belgian royal house simply dropped its German identity altogether. The official story is that this was about wartime patriotism. But when you look at what else was happening across Europe in that same decade, the libraries being burned, the buildings being demolished, the maps being quietly withdrawn, a much stranger pattern starts to emerge. This is the story of what those royal houses might have been hiding. If you want more investigations that go behind the official version of history, hit subscribe right now. We post a new documentary every single week, and the next one digs even deeper into the Great Reset of the early 20th century. On July 17, 1917, King George V of the United Kingdom signed a royal proclamation that erased his own family name from public record. Until that day, the British royal family had been known as the House of Saxe-Coburg and Gotha. It was a German name, inherited from Prince Albert, the husband of Queen Victoria. By 1917, with the First World War in its third year and German aircraft dropping bombs on London, the name had become a serious political liability. The official explanation was simple. The king wanted to distance the monarchy from its German cousins, including Kaiser Wilhelm II, who happened to be his first cousin. So he chose a new name, Windsor, taken from the castle. Clean, English, untraceable. But there is something strange about that proclamation. King George did not just change the family name, he also erased every German title held by his relatives. Princes became dukes, duchies were dissolved, entire branches of the family were simply written out of the public record. One historian later counted at least 34 titles that vanished overnight. The British government called it a patriotic gesture. But the speed and the totality of the erasure suggests something else was going on. They were not just changing a name, they were rewriting a family tree. What makes the timing even more suspicious is what was happening inside the royal archives at Windsor Castle during those same months. Librarians were reorganizing the holdings under a new classification system. Letters between Queen Victoria and her German relatives, which had been freely available to scholars before the war, were quietly sealed. Portraits of certain ancestors were removed from public galleries and placed into storage where they remain to this day. A new official biography of the royal family was commissioned and published within 2 years, presenting a streamlined English version of the lineage that bore little resemblance to what historians had written just a generation earlier. That same year, on the same day in fact, another royal family in Britain made the exact same move. The Battenbergs, a German princely family with close ties to the British crown, anglicised their name to Mountbatten. The patriarch, Prince Louis of Battenberg, had been forced to resign as First Sea Lord of the Royal Navy back in 1914 because of anti-German sentiment. By 1917, his entire family had been stripped of their German titles. He became the Marquis of Milford Haven. His son, also named Louis, would later become Lord Mountbatten of Burma, the last Viceroy of India. But here is the part that gets glossed over in every school textbook. The Battenbergs were not just German nobles. They were the result of a morganatic marriage, which meant they were not technically considered royal by the strict standards of the European houses. They had been creating a new aristocratic identity for themselves for decades before 1917. The name change was not a sudden act of patriotism. It was the final step in a long process of inventing a lineage. By the summer of 1917, that invention was complete, and the paperwork was sealed. 3 years later, in 1920, King Albert I of Belgium quietly dropped the name Saxe-Coburg and Gotha from his family. He did not announce it publicly. He did not sign a famous proclamation. He simply stopped using it. Belgian government documents from before 1920 list the royal family as the House of Wettin or the House of Saxe-Coburg. After 1920, those names disappear from the records. The family becomes, on paper, simply the Royal House of Belgium. No new name was chosen. No replacement was offered. They became a house without a history. And in Belgium, this was not the only thing being quietly erased. The Royal Library in Brussels lost an entire wing of historical records during the war years. Buildings from the 1700s and 1800s were demolished and replaced with modern simplified structures. Maps from before 1900 were withdrawn from public circulation. Even the spelling of certain place names was changed. By the time the dust had settled in the early 20s, the country looked different. The royal house looked different. The records looked different. And almost nobody outside of academia seemed to notice. There is a fourth name change that historians often leave out of this conversation. The Greek royal house, which had ruled since 1863 under the name of Schleswig-Holstein-Sonderburg-Glücksburg, began quietly using just the name House of Greece in their official correspondence starting around 1920. The change was never formalized through legislation. It simply happened. The old name still appears in genealogical reference books, but the family itself stopped using it. When you add Greece to the list, the count becomes 4 royal houses, all connected by blood, all making the same kind of change, all within roughly the same window. 3, or arguably 4, royal families, all within the span of 4 years. The official explanation is that they were all responding to anti-German sentiment after the First World War. And on the surface, that explanation works. But when you start to dig into what else was happening across Europe during that same decade, the pattern becomes much harder to dismiss. Across the continent, archives were being consolidated and centralized. Old buildings were being demolished and replaced with what architects of the period called modern, simplified, rational structures. Languages were being standardized through new dictionaries that quietly dropped older words and grammar forms. Currencies were being redesigned from the ground up. National histories were being rewritten in school textbooks, with entire chapters being added or removed. And the people leading these changes, the bureaucrats, the architects, the historians, the linguists, were almost all educated in the same small handful of universities, funded by the same small handful of foundations. It is as if the entire continent quietly agreed, in the space of a single decade, to start over. And the royal families, the supposed keepers of the old genealogies, were the very first to wipe themselves clean. This is where the story gets controversial. For the past several years, a growing community of researchers, often grouped under the label of Tartaria, have been pointing to a much larger pattern. They argue that the entire official history of the 19th century, including the carefully maintained genealogies of European royal houses, was constructed or heavily edited during a coordinated reset that took place between roughly 1900 and 1930. According to this view, the buildings we now call neoclassical were not new constructions of the 18th and 19th centuries. They were the remnants of an older civilization, repurposed and given new histories. The royal families we know today did not inherit ancient bloodlines stretching back to the Middle Ages. They were installed or rebranded during the reset to give the new nation-states a sense of artificial continuity. The name changes of 1917 and 1920 are, in this view, not patriotic gestures at all. They are the final cleanup of a much older operation. Now, mainstream historians dismiss this idea entirely. They point to genealogical records, to portraits, to coins, to letters. But here is the thing that keeps the Tartaria theory alive, even among serious researchers. Many of those records, portraits, coins, and letters cannot be independently verified before the 1920s. The chain of provenance has gaps, and every time researchers try to fill those gaps, they run into archives that were destroyed during the war, libraries that burned in suspicious fires, or documents that remain classified for another 50 years. Let us pull back from the speculation for a moment and look at what we can actually confirm. We know that 3 royal houses changed their names within a 4-year span. We know that those changes were unusually thorough, erasing not just names but titles, branches, and in some cases entire generations from public records. We know that the same decade saw a continent-wide effort to standardize and consolidate national archives, often resulting in the destruction or sequestration of older documents. We know that the architects, historians, and bureaucrats leading that effort were a small, interconnected group with shared funding sources. And we know that the explanation offered to the public, simple wartime patriotism, does not fully account for the scale or the coordination of the changes. Whether you accept the Tartaria framework or not, the questions are legitimate. Why did 3 royal houses move in lockstep? Why did the erasure go so deep, well beyond what mere name changes would require? And why is so much of what happened in that decade still hidden behind classified files and conveniently missing archives? The answers we have been given do not fit the evidence we can actually examine. Here is another detail that rarely gets mentioned in the standard accounts. Not every royal house in Europe changed its name in the 1910s and 1920s. The Spanish Bourbons kept their name, the Swedish Bernadottes kept their name, the Italian Savoys kept their name, the Norwegian royal house, despite its Danish-German origins, kept its identity intact. The Dutch House of Orange-Nassau kept its name. The Portuguese Braganzas, although deposed by then, still kept their identity in exile. So what did the houses that changed all have in common? They were all closely connected to the old German Confederation, the loose collection of states that had been reorganized into the German Empire in 1871. And more importantly, they were all sitting on genealogies that trace back through a series of carefully arranged strategic marriages to a single small family network in Central Europe, the Wettin-Ernestine line, which had spent the previous 2 centuries placing its sons and daughters on thrones across the continent. When you actually map out the connections on paper, what you find is not 3 independent royal houses making 3 independent decisions. You find one extended family making one coordinated move. The proclamations went out from London, from Brussels, and quietly from Athens. But the bloodline behind all of them traced to the same small region of central Germany. The same archives, the same family records, the same set of inconvenient documents that suddenly needed to be reorganized, sealed, or destroyed. Whether that coordinated move was about hiding German ancestry from a hostile post-war public, hiding something far older that predated the modern nation-states, or hiding something else entirely, depends on how far down the trail you are willing to follow. The mainstream answer is the first option. The Tartaria researchers argue for the second. The truth may turn out to be something nobody has guessed yet. You might be asking why any of this actually matters today. Royal families do not run countries the way they used to. Names are just names. Old archives are just old archives. But consider this for a moment. The official history of the entire 20th century was written by the same institutions that quietly managed the name changes back in the 1910s. Our textbooks, our museums, our universities, our encyclopedias. If those institutions were willing to coordinate the erasure of 3 royal lineages within a single decade, then a real question opens up. What else were they willing to coordinate? What else has been quietly rewritten while almost nobody was looking? The story of the Windsors, the Mountbattens, and the Belgian royal house is not just about 3 families and their public relations problems. It is about how easily the past can be edited when the right people decide it needs to be edited. It is about the long, slow, mostly invisible project of constructing the world we now think of as normal and ancient and inevitable. Consider one final piece of evidence before we close this investigation. In 1922, just 2 years after the Belgian name change, the League of Nations established the International Committee on Intellectual Cooperation. Its stated mission was to coordinate the rebuilding of European cultural institutions after the war. Its actual function, according to its own internal memoranda, was to standardize the way history was taught across the continent. New curricula were drafted, new approved textbooks were distributed, national histories that had once openly contradicted each other suddenly began to align, and the names of certain royal houses, whether in French, English, or German textbooks, were quietly updated to match the new official versions. By 1930, the rewriting was complete. The generation that had lived through the original names was beginning to die off, and the generation that followed grew up never knowing that anything had been changed at all. 3 royal houses, 1 decade, a new name for each. The official story explains some of it. The deeper story, if there is one, is still buried in archives we are not allowed to see, and libraries that mysteriously burned. If you want to keep digging into the parts of history that do not make the textbooks, hit subscribe and turn on notifications. The next investigation goes even further back, into the buildings, the maps and the empires that the modern world insists never existed.